Hey everyone, this was an interesting year for Dead by Daylight, with clear ups and downs. Let's discuss the best and worst parts of it today. The year started out with a delay to the very first chapter, which ended up being Tokyo Ghoul. This was down to the promised quality of life changes or Operation Health update, an overall promising looking update at the time that aimed to target the problematic areas of the game that had been struggling. The first phase of this happened across April to June, which is what caused the initial delay of Tokyo Ghoul. I would argue this was a positive as well. We got some solid changes at this point, with additions of gamma options, go next prevention, and map offering reworks. I'd argue at this point in time the health update was actually quite good. We then got to the release of Tokyo Ghoul. This was a very controversial chapter upon release, and largely due to Kaneki's power, which was both a highly requested one, featuring Spider-Man-like movement, but also quite hated due to many of the inbuilt bonuses he had to his kit, such as his lock-on and ability to apply deep wound easily. Kaneki is a tough one, and I'm not sure if I consider him to be overall positive or negative to the game. He definitely sold incredibly well, and to this day is one of the most played killers, I think the most played actually, but he's also one of the most hated, and I can't say I'm the biggest fan of playing or facing him. To many he's a fun movement killer, but to others he's incredibly boring or frustrating to face. I do think this is a divide between killer and survivor players largely. Most killer players probably quite enjoy playing him, but he's miserable on the survivor side to face, creating a frustrating dynamic not too dissimilar to someone like Legion. The next big event of the year was Arella Rose and her half-chapter Steady Pulse. This I'd say was almost an entirely positive moment for the community. It was a big win in many ways. It was great representation, it brought back marketing for original chapters, and we got some additional and positive quality of life changes again. There were some changes that were slightly questionable, such as the alterations to rarity colors and an updated quest system, which did actually prove to be better than the old one in the end, I would argue. The bad part of this patch was undeniably the complete destruction of the lore, however. The lore, sure, a lot of people don't care about it, but it was entirely halted for around 6 months this year, all for it to be eventually slotted into this tiny button at the bottom of the home screen. The announced rework to the archives was exciting and sounded like it was going to bring an updated and more plentiful archive system. However, it ended up just reducing it heavily to just a single archive entry every 2.5 months, where we'd had at least 3 before that. The archives also lost a lot of their visual flair, changing from the Library of the Observer and the Web of Challenges into just books and a long list of quests. There was some definite soul lost here, so overall this was a negative, I think. As the anniversary of the game approached, we got a live stream to accompany it, and it did appear exciting. However, one part that really stood out to the community was the treatment of Frank Stone, a character from Dead by Daylight's story game, The Casting of Frank Stone, which released in 2024. It was announced that instead of being the focal point of a chapter, he'd be coming to the game as just a skin for Trapper, something that had been identified before as highly improbable. This idea was then dropped due to community reaction, and later it was announced that he'd be coming in some way in the future. We don't really know what this means, whether he'll be a part of a full chapter, a half chapter, or a charm, who knows. It certainly sounds positive, but equally I'll believe it when I see it, to be honest, as we've had a lot of promises given this year. After this, we did get debatably the biggest positive of the year, FNAF. FNAF was a huge success this year, and was sort of bound to be. Despite the chapter having some flaws, maybe with a slightly odd power in some ways, it was overall a huge smash hit and deserved the success it got. It brought along the biggest player peak the game's ever had, which is crazy 9 years in, and it featured a ton of cool ideas, with the jump scares and security doors. It's a shame we got no survivor, but I do love the map, with it being incredibly detailed and placed into the Withered Isle realm, which works really well. We also got some big surprises, such as the Yellow Rabbit skin featuring and voiced by Matthew Lillard. There was so much positivity around this time, and that was really nice for a year that felt a bit rocky so far. It's nice to look back on as well and remember that there were huge positives this year, even if from here on it was largely downhill. The other hugely positive part of this period was the announcement of the Grimoire and the Create Your Own Chapter, an initiative by the devs to get the community to create a future chapter for DBD, with us voting on various options or paths, with us so far designing an angel killer who's likely coming in late 2026 or early 2027. This was and is an awesome idea to not only engage the community, but make us feel involved and have an impact on something that will actually be added to the game. There have been some gaps in communication when it comes to the Grimoire, but overall it's been a really positive and simply cool experience to be able to literally create our own chapter as a community. So big props there, this was positive. The anniversary itself, I have to say, was a bit disappointing. This year we got basically the same event as last year, but it felt stripped back and actually slightly regressed from it. Trix, the mad designer and narrator of the event, spoke less and interacted less with the player. This must have been down to the complaints of people finding her annoying, in my assumption, or possibly the devs thought it best to leave her out as she may be confusing to the new FNAF players. I'm not sure, but I think the event felt shallower as a result. It felt like the same thing being repeated, with not much change. I have to say more widely too that this is how all the events this year felt. Halloween was incredibly samey and pieced back from the year prior, with the core new addition being the ability to auto-repair gens. Even modes like 2v8 felt like they didn't really receive enough updates or things to engage us with. Survivor in that mode still remains pretty boring, honestly. Killers got some new killers added, but I feel this was the biggest element to change, aside the clearly amazing reduction to queue times with the addition of play whilst you wait. Overall though, events were pretty boring this year. This brought us up to the surprise half chapter of the year in August, The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead was a big disappointment this year for me, unfortunately. It was my most anticipated license for quite some time, honestly, after Resident Evil came to the game. And so how it launched was very disappointing. Whilst I do like the models of both Rick and Michonne, they do have plenty of other small disappointments and issues, like the scuffed voice lines and multiple VAs. The entire surrounding Walking Dead patch was also of course quite a disappointment, with it having a large number of bugs and the whole Jim the Beam debacle, as well as the Chandler Riggs stream and how that whole thing went. This entire period for the game was just a big shame for me, after looking forward so much for this chapter. I'm an outlier too in that I actually do like the Walking Dead map, Fallen Refuge, however it never appears, and I've played on it maybe 5 times since it came out in like August, was it, or July? Disappointing all around, unfortunately. As much as I love The Walking Dead, and I love these characters who are in the game, don't get me wrong, the whole thing was quite disappointing, unfortunately. It was around this time too where bugs in general became incredibly prominent and seemed to just keep spawning and still don't seem really under wraps. Jim was the most obvious one, but there were so many others. I think whilst the whole Jim thing was funny too, it was also a bit of a sad sign of bugs being largely overlooked, and it being put into question whether the game was being tested at all. If a bug this large and obvious, a literal beam in the offering screen, could get through the cracks, what else could? I hate to do this triple threat, but the other negative part of this year was Fog Vials, a new item for survivors that basically everyone knew was coming. I don't think the idea of a fog vial as an item is actually that bad either. In fact, the way they were implemented within the Halloween events as these smokescreen bubbles was actually quite effective, I think. However, the way they were implemented was a bit different, instead spawning these huge clouds that would swarm a much larger area. The main issue with them is their inconsistency, I'd say. From map to map, they perform and cloak very differently due to the lighting, I guess, mainly. On launch, they were pretty overtuned, but then got completely dumpstered. Nowadays, having just 2 charges per vial and having a much smaller area of effect than before, and no one really uses them, it seems. I see one now and then, but hardly frequently. It's a little sad that the first new item in what, I think 9 years, has already fallen to the wayside. I hope they are restored somewhat one day or reworked in some form. I've always thought a timer would work a bit better on the fog vials over having charges, for example. The other huge thing around this time was the Maya's Dash rework. This was a shock for many, as this hadn't really been assumed as a priority, and I still don't think it really was. I do find it a bit confusing why of all things we got this over a rework to characters who need it much more, like the Skull Merchant, Hag, Trickster. It was also controversial because many liked the original Myers, although he was quite outdated for the modern game. He was lore accurate and felt like Myers. The new Myers is much more gamey, and does feel less like Michael Myers, I will say. I was an initial hater of this rework and didn't quite understand why it was happening, but I do have to say, with time, I've come to appreciate it. Sure, it does lose some soul, I think, but Myers is in a much better and consistent state now, making this overall a pretty good change, I think. To end off the negative or controversial saga of this part of the year, we got the announcement that there were delays coming with the ongoing efforts toward the health update. This was understandable, but also disappointing, with Sinister Grace being delayed by a month and Stranger Things Part 2 being pushed back to January of 2026. This has been pretty rough, and I don't think we've ever had such a big delay in the whole of DBD history. The reason it feels very bad, I think, too, is that it feels like not much has been fixed despite the delay. We get less content, but a lot isn't getting better either, with time instead being spent on testing various mechanics that we've already tested. The whole thing is quite frustrating, I think. So whilst the delays were there with good intention, I don't think they've really succeeded in their purpose. The final chapter of the year, therefore, was Sinister Grace, featuring the Krasu and V. This was a slight improvement for original chapters, but was the only original chapter of the year, at least full one. The last before this being Doomed Course, which was a resounding flop seemingly, and received no marketing at all. Sinister Grace was different in that it actually got a ton, and it was all really great. It was awesome to see original content get this kind of attention again. However, upon the chapter's launch, it was honestly a bit disappointing. Whilst Krasu is visually impressive and definitely delivers in that aspect, she doesn't really in pretty much any other area, I'd say. Her power is pretty boring and feels quite clunky still, uninspired despite its visual flair, which has led to her play rate falling exponentially. No one really plays Krasu already. The one reason she did have a huge number of players was upon her release, where she was very overtuned. She's still strong now as well, but no one really plays her. Compare this to Kaneki, who also got heavily nerfed but is still strong, yet people still play him. People don't really play Krasu. The chapter as a whole therefore was brushed over relatively quickly, despite it being quite exciting, I think. This brings us up to the 9.3.0 update and PTB, an update that has once again been controversial due to the changes made and suggested in the PTB. The main ones causing an issue are the suggested anti-changes, changes made to stop tunneling, slugging, and camping, which often just go too far or overboard with their ideas. So we were set to test these again, and once again the reaction was pretty much the same. People didn't really like them in this overdone form. A lot of this feeling like a bit of a waste of time. This, along with the new palette density changes, which have caused struggles on both sides on different occasions. One of few positive elements of this patch was the cool quality of life changes, like introducing new scratch mark colors. The issues this year do feel repetitive and tiring though, I have to say. For a year where the game was meant to be getting fixed, it does feel like we don't have much to show for it, due to largely focusing on these tests that are repeatedly mentioned by the community to not work, yet it feels like we keep testing these things. I think it is equally undeniable though that we've had a lot of really great quality of life changes this year, some things that we've been wanting in the game for quite some time and really do improve the experience, like gamma options and the new scratch mark colors and stuff like that. So I think equally credit where credit is due. This year ended off with the announcement of Stranger Things 2. This was originally supposed to be the November chapter of 2025, instead now releasing in January 2026. Whilst I'm not too disappointed about having to wait a bit longer, it does feel like a bit of a shame, as I mentioned before, due to there being not much to show for the health updates of this year. It's an exciting chapter to come for sure though, and I do look forward to seeing more Stranger Things content in the game, especially as it's been years since we've had any new skins or adjustments to the characters. To conclude, this year had ups and downs, and for every success there was a flop. For the massive great quality of life changes we got a number of relatively pointless reworks to things or tests conducted. For every successful chapter there was another forgotten or lost within the chaos. This will go down as a year, I think, of great success, but admittedly of great failure too. One which will always be controversial, I imagine, but one I ultimately hope will be remembered as a key stepping stone to a stronger and better Dead by Daylight going into 2026 and through the rest of year 10. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.